This first room, the speaker you'll be hearing is Miss Christiane Buggs. She is a board member of the Equity Alliance, and she's also the District 5 representative for MNPS schools. I will let her introduce herself a little bit further, but just briefly to go over the norms, let's just monitor our airtime, make sure that everyone has a chance to speak and engage with Ms. Buggs and ask all of the amazing questions I'm sure you have after watching that video. And let's make sure that if you do have any questions or if you have any burning thoughts while someone else is speaking, absolutely feel free to drop those in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat the entire time. I would love to hear all of your thoughts and all of the ways that we just kind of branch out and build on these concepts together. There will be a 5-minute warning, or I'm sorry, there will be a 1-minute warning followed by a 5-second warning. If anything appears on your screen, just relax. Once again, you're not moving, I am. So after Ms. Buggs speaks for about 20 minutes, you are going to hear from the next panelist and then so on and so forth. So you can just sit back and relax and the screen will do all the work for you today. Does anyone have any questions so far? Fantastic. How's our audio doing? Can everyone hear? Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. One more thing, if you happen to unmute to speak at the same time as somebody else, and you just both start speaking at the same time, feel free to just mute or click out or decide amongst yourselves. I'm really not here to point and say, okay, Louise, it's your turn. Okay, Cindy, it's your turn. I mean, this really is meant to be a very organic, authentic, casual conversation with an absolutely amazing individual. And here she is. Hi, Ms. Buggs, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great. We are so excited that you are here with us today. My name is Sydney Britt. I'm going to be your facilitator this afternoon. I just was briefly telling them how amazing you are, but I'll let you do that. So we can just jump right in and get started.
Sure. Well, sure. Well, thank you all for joining me. My name is Christiane Buggs. I am, or better yet, I grew up in Nashville, and I grew up in a predominantly African-American part of town in Bordeaux, if you're familiar with the Nashville area. I should have, could have been zoned to Whites Creek, but my parents sent me to MLK, which is one of our magnet schools here in Nashville. And it wasn't until I got to Tennessee State that I really began to kind of unpack and understand inequity. So got to TSU, earned a physics degree, started working at the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is a branch of NASA in California, because I had a physics degree. I was studying astronomy, and I didn't see many African Americans, didn't see many women, and that's what kind of pushed me into education. My goal was to just inspire young people and make them feel like they were math people, that they could do this thing called STEM, and was met with a lot of pushback in my classroom, and then subsequently my own bias. I didn't realize until I kind of reflected later on how often I would pair up my Black or my Black female students with white male peers or with their male peers to make sure they got it. And so the more I began to reflect a bit, and my school was taken over by the state and I didn't really understand what that meant, all of these things made a perfect storm for me to run for school board. So I've been on the school board for 4 years. I'm up for re-election next month. I'm thankfully unopposed, but it's doing the work in the school board that I've really been able to figure out my place in education equity and in shifting narratives and shifting resources and just being more intentional with how I support families and students who don't typically engage in advocacy. And I think that is what brought me to the Educators Cooperative. You know, I'd spoken with Greg and I'd heard about this organization, but didn't know much about what it did. But considering his strong stance around equity and around making sure that people, children included, have voice is just, it's so thoughtful. It's so wonderful. And it's something that I want to support for years to come. So ta-da, that is the short version of who I am. I have a 2-year-old son. He is a funny little person, but he is not here today. Thank God his grandmother came and got him, because he always finds a way to pop his fuzzy-headed little self into the screen. So it's just you and I today. So Sydney, feel free to let me know how to move from here.
Oh, and that was my first unmute mistake. I'm sure there will be plenty more this afternoon. So we are now open for questions. please just make sure that you briefly introduce yourself so that everybody can hear and understand who's speaking, and then we can just dive right in. We have 20 minutes of amazing time together, so let's get started. If you have your first question, you can either type it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself.
And sometimes it's hard to ask the first question, so I will give you something to think about as you're thinking. With all of the kind of civil unrest and this nationwide awakening, or better yet, international awakening and bigotry do still exist, that they are still a thing that we've had to cope with. I spoke with some other educators and they said, you know what, we've got to do something around education. We continue to talk about police brutality or the ways in which Black lives don't seem to matter, but we don't really talk about how that impacts young people. You know, these under-resourcing doesn't start in adulthood. Racism doesn't start in adulthood. It is typically fostered from birth. But something that I say, just because it is really important to me to have the conversation and provide the context, is that in many African-American families, we're taught early on that the KKK was made up of authority figures. It wasn't just made up of judges or police officers. It unfortunately also included teachers. It included, you know, the neighborhood grocer. I mean, it was a little bit of everyone. And until we began to really accept that at an existential level and understand that we all have bias that we need to unpack, we'll never be able to move forward, right? So we typically talk about symptoms of bigotry or symptoms of under-resourcing or disenfranchisement. We don't really often talk about the roots of those issues. And those roots are typically stemmed in generational bias in ourselves. You know, I led the conversation by saying that as a Black female astrophysicist, I had the audacity to come back to my classroom and show a bias towards my girls. I paired my girls up with boys just so they could get the science. Like, how dare I, right? And here I am, someone who thinks that I'm unpacking it, who has worked hard to get these master's degrees, and I'm going to be a great teacher, and I haven't unpacked my bias. And so I say that to say, I'm particularly excited about this conversation because we don't ever have it around education, and how either our practices, our pedagogy, the narratives that we push, the way we converse with each other and with young people, how that impacts them for years and decades to come. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I hope I've sparked a question or two.
I'll start. My name's Michelle Andrade, and I'm Director of Communications and Special School Programs at Episcopal School of Nashville. I am really nervous right now, I'll just be super honest, which is good, I guess. I loved the little video that they sent out earlier. It was like, yeah, let's get uncomfortable. So I figure, let me ask a really uncomfortable question. I cannot stop thinking about I have two kids too, just to let you know. One is at Episcopal school with me, and actually one is going to be entering Metro Nashville Public Schools for the first time this year. She's going to Nashville School of the Arts, and
okay.
I'm so excited. This is what she wanted. She's very excited about it, but I can't stop thinking about the students in this COVID pandemic that are being forgotten, who are I got these interviews or these questionnaires this week about, do you need technology? Do you need a computer? And I'm thinking about these children whose families are saying, yes, I need a hotspot. Yes, I need a computer. And you know, how I didn't have to say, yes, I need this for my child because we have internet and we have a computer. And thinking about these kids who may not have more than one parent at home, or whose parents aren't able to work from home right now, and what is happening to those children, and where's the racial component in that? Because I'm imagining the children that are not going to get served and are going to drop through the cracks of this system right now. And my first thought is, they are not my white kids. And so I don't know where the question is in that. I mean, maybe it's more, I'd love to hear what other people are thinking about this, and to just say it out loud, that I can't stop thinking about these kids. And yet everyone's trying to keep everyone safe and not send people back to school too early. And these kids who are at home trying to navigate distance learning, technology, all these things all by themselves. So thank you.
No, that was great. And I do hope to make this a true conversation. So please feel free to offer suggestions or thoughts or insight at any point. And I'll just kind of say, as a community member and as a community leader, I've just been trying to think about how is it that I can step in the gaps for those families. The reality is we're not typically going to hear from those that are disenfranchised because they're not used to advocating for themselves. That is a harsh reality, but one that if we accept, we can start to be a bit more innovative about how we advocate for them and with them, because a few friends and I started this nonprofit called the Equity Alliance. And our goal was it's like once we started kind of fleshing out the purpose and the mission, it seemed like such a lofty goal, because you can't just teach people how to advocate. You have to engage them and make it seem like it's worth their while, like it's something tangible. And then you have to empower them to advocate. So considering all the multi-layers of advocacy and disenfranchisement, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be relying on allies and each other to speak up for them, to say, hey, there's something we forgot about, or when I've had to spend money, I think about those who haven't. Are there ways that we can better support them? Sometimes it's thinking about your time, talent, and treasure. What is it that you can offer? And I think about a lot of my days in that way. Have I given my time, my talent, or my treasure in some way today? So if I don't have the time to do something, it may be that I send an email and offer my talent. And I say, I offer my treasure and I donate to organizations that specifically tackle an issue that I want to see, elevated. There's so much to say here. I would love to hear some other thoughts, but I think it at least begins with us. And I say us, even though I'm part of MNPS, us reaching out to MNPS and saying, hey, you may have missed this, or I know a family that needs that, or can I connect someone to you all? I have a group here that's disenfranchised in this way. They need this specific resource. Where can I get it?
I would like to jump in. I totally agree with what was just said. And I think one of the things that bothered me a great deal in the spring with online was that I knew that the students, I work at Paragon Mills, and I knew my students didn't have access. And I knew that they were gonna fall behind. So I completely appreciate what you're saying. On the other hand, now that we're moving into this one-to-one sort of, or semi one-to-one district, one of the things that I learned, I think it was this morning or late last night, I can't remember, the email came in, that those computers are only going out to students who have completed the survey that was sent out earlier this summer about whether or not they're going to be doing online or in person. And if you said no, then you're going to get a computer. But if you didn't respond at all, there's no intention at this point of finding you to give you the computer. So what we're doing at our school is we're calling those families. We know who responded, and so we're calling. And so I would say, like, if you're at another school and this is an issue, or if you're not even sure if it's an issue, I know that only 338 of our 600 kids responded to the survey. So we're breaking up those lists and we're calling people and we're reaching out to students. And I think what you're saying in regard to advocacy, that's a way to advocate, by reaching out and finding out what do our students need so that we can make sure that they do not fall further behind.
For sure. I think in a COVID-free world, it would have been great to be able to just knock doors. I mean, sometimes, even as a school board member, on Saturdays, I would just pick a street, walk for about 2 hours and just knock doors just to engage my community. And that was a good way for me to understand who hadn't been engaged, who had needs that I hadn't considered, that kind of thing. But like you said, since we have to be safer together at home, it's perfectly reasonable to reach out and just call. I mean, I think I've been particularly excited to see the different churches and other nonprofits or faith-based organizations step up and say, well, we're going to house pods at our place of worship for 3 hours per day for the first 30 students that come, or we are going to provide access to internet in a socially distant way in our lobby. I mean, those kind of things all help. So I think having, even as a community member, if you're not connected to a school, there is still a place for you to plug in. There's still a way. And so I think as educators, it's on us to relay that out to the community and say, we as educators are gonna fight and we're gonna do our part. But hey, you non-educators, we can still use you also. If you have a couple of hours a day to make videos or to post signs in your community or to call neighbors or contact people that have children in the system, whatever it may be, whatever it looks like, it will all help. while you're still thinking about some other questions, because I'm sure your head is whirling, I think I've been most nervous about, and I think we're starting to hear that bubble up more, that disenfranchisement is often steeped in race or class, but there is also an exceptional component to that. Our exceptional needs students will likely suffer the most. I mean, the idea that those students, I have a friend of a neighbor who their child was on the spectrum and had learned a total of about 5 words. I think he's an 11-year-old boy. He has some extreme occupational therapy needs, physical therapy needs, and then speech therapy needs. He learned 5 words. By the end of April, he had lost all 5. He could not say, any of those words. And that was after how many years of work. And so the work we do can be undone quickly if we're not vigilant. And it's unfortunate, I have to make this plug, it's so unfortunate that we don't view resourcing and budgeting and allocating of funds to public education. We don't see that as a priority. I would love to live in a city. I would love to live in a city that cared most about its young people. I would love to. We don't live in that city yet. That doesn't mean that we can't. We just haven't made the paradigm shift as a community. So what I'm hoping will bubble up as we're in the middle of, or at the beginning of early voting season, is that people really engage in a different way with the budgets of their city, their state, and their federal government. That we look at who holds the purse strings, who writes checks, and then how can we influence where those checks go. As a teacher, I don't know about you all, but as a teacher, I did not know that we were funded by the mayor. I didn't know that was who I needed to go to. I thought central office just had this big bucket of money that they were mismanaging. Lo and behold, it's 2 pennies. If they're mismanaging, it's 2 pennies that they're rubbing together, So I'm hoping that we are fired up to talk about resources, because last spring shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have been the way that we had to operate with young people. We should have already been a 1-to-1 city. We should have already had laptops for students. We should have already had hotspots. But I could, shoulda, woulda, coulda all day, but we just can't repeat the past. And I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. Feel free to jump in.
There's actually a question in the chat from Cindy Crenshaw. She says she's wondering about your opinion and what white teachers can do now in COVID to improve our cultural responsiveness.
Ooh, child, where do I start? There's so much. So there are many different resources in it. I think it just depends on the route you personally want to take. So like I told you, I see Dr. Gibbs here on the call. He and I and a few other community or education leaders around the city are developing this equity policy, which it mandates bias training for all staff, from custodial staff to the board and the director. It would mandate that, even if it's 2 or 3 hours. I think encouraging some reflection, talking through best practices will help us all and will benefit our students, right? But there's also a component around talent development. How do we best develop, train, retain, and support educators as they go through a culturally responsive journey? How do we make sure that we are elevating voices that wouldn't typically be elevated? Just all those things around talent and pipeline development. But then there's also a curriculum review portion of it, because we're in the Bible Belt, and I am AME, right? So I love my church, but being in the Bible Belt, we have typically kind of whitewashed our history in Nashville. We've in one of our standards, one of the social studies standards, it calls the KKK a vigilante group. And so it's little things like that, or in one of the science standards has students being taught about 4 white male scientists who did a thing. It doesn't talk at all about their female nurses or the female mathematicians that work with them. It doesn't talk at all about the minority members of their team. And so it's things like that we've got to start combating also, but it's gonna take there's gonna be a long on-ramp. We're gonna have to review a bunch of different standards. So I can say that that's one thing that I've tackled, and that didn't come to my mind organically. It was after I spoke with other educators. So one thing that I would say, long-winded way of saying, get with some like-minded people and see what you can come up with. Is it something as small as maybe engaging in some books and some curriculum on your own time? Or could it be as large as inserting yourself in a different way when you engage your kids. So if you're asked to do 2 hours of synchronous time, learning with your kids, could 2 other hours of your day be spent just calling them individually or calling on students that, you've seen their file and you see have any kind of behavior issues that you just may want to build a special relationship with or check in with? Or if you have access to their CUME files, so much can be found in CUME files that we don't use to improve our cultural relatability with students. Just understanding what their historic needs have been, what their suspension rates have been, what their absentee rates have been, and trying to figure out how you can support them even from a distance. I mean, think back to being a child and how happy you were for a teacher to like you. How happy you were for a teacher to just say your name and it not be in a negative way, but just good morning, Christian. I still think about my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Masterson, and just hearing her voice. And she was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, statuesque beauty. And she was just so sweet. So I couldn't wait to hear from her. And so I think the culturally responsive piece is not just you tackling bias. I mean, that's helpful, but just actively trying to engage students that maybe you wouldn't have had a lot in common with, that will add to your perspective for sure. I'd love to hear some other educators' thoughts about that too, though.
We actually have just entered into your 5-minute warning, and the chat is full of some amazing questions. So first up from Randall, how do we empower early career teachers who don't have much systemic power to advocate for issues of equity in their schools?
If you don't mind, I would like to use a point of privilege to tap into Dr. Gibbs. I'm going to form some thoughts around that, Mr. Lahan, because I like where you're going. But Dr. Gibbs, any thoughts you have? Because you're a phenomenal education leader.
Hey, can you repeat that question one more time? I was just getting ready to start walking and moving around because I'm gonna be tapped into this conversation while I'm driving to Memphis.
Sure, absolutely. How do we empower early career teachers who don't have much systemic power to advocate for issues of equity in their school?
Yeah, so I would say for something like that, the experience isn't a prerequisite to advocacy. You see that a lot with a lot of our young people engaging into advocacy work. So it's incumbent upon us as experienced educators or just experienced individuals in general to just empower them to find their voice. What I find with a lot of our young educators, they struggle with trying to find their voice because they're trying to figure out where they fit in the grand scheme of how to impact and change lives. So if we just encourage and empower them to not only find their voice, but use their voice for good, especially if their voice already garners some type of privilege, that in itself will begin to help push that narrative. But it's when we try to kind of stamp out and try to shun folks' voice when they start to really try to push the conversation and have uncomfortable conversations when it comes to things that they know they need to advocate for, that a lot of our young people get disengaged and turned off. And you see some of our most passionate educators leave the profession because they feel like, one, they're not accepted, or their voice is trying to be smashed out. So I would say we just need to just make sure that we're encouraging them to find their voice and use their voice for situations that are meaningful to them.
And I love that. And I would also say there is still a culture of fear in education, and in many spaces. There is a culture of fear that when you speak up, that some harm will be done to you. So a practical suggestion would be find an ally, find an elevated ally. I always offer up my number and my email address because I want educators and families to feel comfortable reaching out to me. So I would say, find someone who you know is going to have your back, is going to keep you from getting fired. I mean, that is unfortunately a real thing that we've got to consider. But then I would say it can be very small things that they do to advocate. It can be not only holding themselves accountable to use appropriate language and culturally responsive pedagogy, but it can also be just not engaging with people who don't. So, I've had peers.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just got the 1-minute warning, so we're down to about 20 seconds. So sorry to interrupt. This is an amazing conversation. Go ahead and finish up your thoughts.
I'll just say really quickly that, sometimes you can maybe not shun or shame, but stay away from people who are doing something inappropriate, or just, slowly nudge them in the right direction, hold them accountable and make them feel like, that wasn't really appropriate. Let's do better. Those small tasks, those small conversations can go a long way. And it's at least a start.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Christian, you and I will be rotating together, and everyone else can remain here. Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure to meet you.
Hello.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sydney Britt. I'm going to be the EdCo facilitator for our conversation this afternoon, and I am so excited to introduce Ms. Christiane Buggs to you. She is the MNPS School Board Representative for District 5, and she's also a board member of the Equity Alliance. Just a few reminders of the norms this afternoon. Once again, you don't have to do anything. You can sit back and relax, let the screen do all of the work. You'll be staying in this room the entire time. If you have a question, please feel free to either just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak up, or you can drop it in the chat. I'd be more than happy to introduce that question for you. The last thing, let's just be aware of how often we're speaking, aware of our own airtime. We only have 20 minutes together, and so I would love for everybody to allow their voice to be heard and allow ourselves to hear from other people. So let's just jump right in. Ms. Buggs, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Well, you did such a good job of introducing me that we can just jump into questions or thoughts. I think I would want to lead with back in May, after the world saw an adult African-American man lose his life after screaming for his mother. I think finally we were awakened to the idea that, hey, racism is still a thing. There is still a bias that we are battling. And something that I try to share often to provide context is that in many African-American families, we grow up learning that the KKK wasn't just made up of judges or lawyers or police officers. It was just made up of authority figures. So it could be your grocer and it could be your teacher. I mean, and that, I think I say that not to suggest that people are bad or that groups of people are bad, but that we all have some kind of bias that we need to unpack. And so for that reason, a group of educators and I have been developing this anti-racism policy that would mandate bias training, because when we look at inequity, disenfranchisement, under-resourcing based on race, I think we talk about the symptom. We don't talk about the root, and the root is typically personal. It's that we haven't, as people, as educators, as adults, unpacked our bias, and that impacts how young people are affected. It impacts how we view education or how we view educating someone else's child. So I would love for you all to be on this journey. I'm gonna make it kind of citywide. If anyone wants to be part of the language review or help talk through that, we can dive in more. But let's get this conversation going, or re-going, since you all have already been talking.
Thanks for being here, Ms. Buggs. And you touched on something just now that that kind of just has me thinking or questioning. How do we have this conversation? Any advice for framing this conversation for racism deniers? Because I've encountered, even with family members, sadly, who kind of deny that racism is still a problem. This myth that, no, we're past that now. Like so what is some advice you can offer for how to frame this conversation in the classroom, where we're likely to run into students who have inherited that bias from home that, oh no, racism is like, we're past that now?
That's a toughie. I mean, that is a toughie. I think there's so many different ways you could go with it. For some of our peers, for some adults, or even some children that comparison is going to be your safety. Being able to offer comparisons or say, what about this person or this situation in comparison to another that you know of? I think what I encounter a lot with those kind of racism deniers is that they'll find their Black person or their, the exceptional Negro that they know. I'm sorry, but that's just what we call it in our friend group, the exceptional Negro syndrome. They'll find the exceptional Negro and say, what about this person? And so being able to point to that person and say, well, that's not an anomaly, that there are many more like them, or there could be many more like them if they had the resources or the network. So I say all the time, I am literally an astrophysicist. I worked for NASA. I have 2 degrees. I am a single mother though. And 2 years ago, I was making $35,000 a year. It wasn't, I think I'm smart. I think I have a good work ethic, but I don't have a network. And being on the school board, of course, has elevated my network and it's opened me up to other people who have offered different scenarios for me to work in. But I use that example all the time when I would talk about other people that I would see being elevated. Again, me drawing the comparison doesn't mean that that white male shouldn't be in the position that he's in. But I want to understand why it's not that more of people like me, people of color or women, why we're not invited to those tables. Why is it that I could not find a comparable job? And I know that's one very singular example, but I think, again, just offering some comparisons, not allowing people to use one person as an exception and making sure that they speak about dynamics as a whole or demographics as a whole can begin to make shifts. But I would love to hear some other thoughts on it, because I struggle with that also. I sometimes just have to tune out, and I know that's not helpful.
I was going to say, Chris, in response to your question, that when conversations happen in the classroom, I think it's very important that you validate the student and what they're saying, because once they tell you something and then you start to go against them, you've lost them. When they are asking for the conversation or you've initiated the conversation, but when children don't feel validated, it spirals into other things and it can impact you like in a great way. That's why that also goes with what I had placed into the chat with students trusting you. If a student doesn't trust you, you can be amazing. They're not listening to you. They don't care. I mean, and that's just the reality, because relationships are important no matter what color the students are. And the children, they just have to feel validated, because I have watched colleagues struggle with children who have been labeled as bad, they don't listen, they don't such and such. Then they get to me, I don't have those issues. Well, it's the same kid. But my attitude and the way I approach the child or the student, and I'm a listener, and I do validate, it made a huge difference. And then the student feels worthy. So I just think that too plays a part in the students, no matter what age they are, high school, middle school, elementary, and I'm on the elementary level. But I do have kids, and I watch my own kids go through those things. When in my household, we were having conversations. Now, the students that I serve, they don't have those kind of conversations to gather an understanding or get a broader perspective outside of just mine. It's just like the scaffolding, they come with nothing. They come with what they think, what they may have experienced. And my students are low income African-American children who do see the police all the time. Most of the time they're white. They don't feel good about that. Why? Because they saw their brother do something, it happened, or a parent might be in jail. Like, you just got to deal with the student's reality and then think about that. And then, like, if you don't have the answer, tell them, I don't know. Rather than lie and pretend or come up with something, it's okay to tell the students, you know what, I need to get back to you on that. I don't know the answer. Let me think about that, and then provide them with the answer, because you know that creates an opportunity to have a different connection with the students, because whether we want to accept it or not, they have their own private conversations, and they know which teacher they can go to say this. They know not to say something, and why are they feeling that way? We probably don't even realize we've said something, done something to make them not feel safe, as bad as that sound. And it probably wasn't even intentional, but I just feel like a teacher's voice is powerful. And I had to come to grips with that, because I know that what I say, they believe me. So I need to be careful with what comes out of my mouth. And I also, if I made a mistake, I tell them I was wrong. Or if they call me on something, it's okay for me to be wrong. And I tell them that I do not know everything. My goal is to learn something every day, even if it comes from you. I don't know everything. So if I made a mistake, tell me that I made a mistake. And they do tell me that I made a mistake. So, I mean, just relaxing and not power pushing, well, I'm the teacher, goes a long way.
And when she said, acknowledging when you mess up, that may be one of the best conversation starters or shifts for pedagogy that you have. If there is ever a time where you see yourself or you feel yourself, offering some kind of bias in your classroom, it's great if you can acknowledge that and say, you know what, I realized that I paired groups in this way and it was inappropriate. Or I apologize because this morning I didn't acknowledge, I don't know, just something, that you maybe should have not acknowledged culturally. That sometimes can be the thing to start shifting students. And then another thing that I'm sure we've all accepted as teachers is that when we plant the seed, we don't always get to bear or see the fruit. So there were 6th graders that I had a decade ago that are now reaching out to me. Like I had one who was white and his dad was a police officer. But his dad was always doing like culturally responsive work. And his son just really didn't understand why he was doing all that work. Like he would always talk about his dad like he was an authority figure. Like, well, you have the gun. I don't know. It was so interesting. But I would place little nuggets here or there. We were in IB school, so we always started our days with quotes and with some kind of worldly thinking. And so maybe a year ago, he reached out to me like, man, Miss Buggs. I get it. And it made me feel good, but I also have to remember that for some of them, they're children. It takes them a bit to really begin to reflect themselves. So it's okay if you don't see them stop denying racism after a week.
All right, we have some really exciting activity going on in the chat here. First, a question from Colin. Hey, Ms. Buggs, what are some ways to leverage the work of the Metro School Board to address racism within schools? Has the district presented any policy ideas to you that could address the concerns you've been hearing?
Okay, so I'm sorry, my Zoom calls are starting to run together. Did I talk to you all about the equity policy? Anti-racism policy?
We're getting mixed reviews, so maybe just a quick overview.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
You talked about a project that you're working on.
Yes, so that is gonna be the anti-racism policy, right? On a larger scale, though, we now have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, director, whatever he's called, Ashford Hughes, who had actually developed an equity agenda for the city while he was working in the mayor's office. So he and I are beginning to just kind of share language, talk through how this over-encompassing agenda can fit this policy and procedures into it. So very quickly, what the school board does is we develop policy and then the director offers procedures that implement that policy, right? So we are looking to do that, but I think because policy can sometimes be so detached from the classroom, it's gonna be imperative that whatever procedures are developed on the MNPS administration side, that it has a lot of teacher buy-in and a lot of teacher review. So that we can Colin, you can, I'll put my number and info in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me and I can send you language. We can start thinking, because I just really want teachers to be able to tell me what it is that they think would help. And then how can we mesh that into policy? Then how can we advocate for resources for that policy? Because that tends to be where the implementation falls through the cracks. We don't have any money to implement it. We don't have the money for the specific trainings or the PD or anything else.
Absolutely. Oh, go right ahead, Nita. Thank you.
I just want briefly, what it reminds me of, Ms. Buggs, is you talk about a system-wide training for teachers, since we are right here in the thick of it. It reminds me of every year how we are instructed by our administrators to go online and there are modules that we can study for the Jason Foundation, where we can guard and look for signs of children who might be showing tendencies of self-destruction or hurtful, bullying or LGBTQ, all of that. So what this is reminding me of is something that we do every year if it can be done in similar fashion of what you're talking about, again, it's going to be costly. But I look forward to the day that it reaches the same level because of what's happening. It's a crisis, and it's been going on for years. And I think it's well past time that we try to address this. And I would be willing also to lend my voice on that project.
I appreciate that. Please, I put my contact info in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me. I can send you the very draft language, draft. But I can send it to you for your review.
Awesome. As we head into the 5-minute warning, there's a really, really great question here from Jordan that is underscored by several people. It says, hello, Ms. Buggs. Thank you for being here. Question, when I open up the room to allow for students to discuss a recent traumatic event, I notice that some of them want to talk and some of them don't. And I have trouble navigating how to protect those who need a safe space to discuss their feelings, while also being careful not to push a conversation on those who are fatigued and don't want to be forced to talk about it again. I always try to read the room, but it is complicated, and I'd love some advice on how you handle this.
Oh, that is a good one. That's a good one. So I would say early on in the years, I'm still building relationships with the kids. I open it up to the full class and just allow those who want to talk. But then while they're talking or not talking, I'm just kind of reviewing faces. I'm looking at faces, or I'm thinking about what demographic of child might be impacted by this. Now, sometimes the stereotypes are thinking that only the Black kids are impacted by something, or only the female students are impacted, can be a little tricky. So sometimes it's just good to reach out to every one of them following the conversation, even if it's over a period of a month, and say, so how'd you feel about that convo? You didn't really talk. Did you have anything to say? Did it make you, and don't pry too much, but certainly offering the conversation individually, that goes a long way. And then you'd be surprised by month 6, how everyone is either talking, or those who won't talk because they only want to talk to you about it. Great question. I did see something from Mike about our previous video, just saying that being anti-racist in all classes, yes. I mean, because we tend to only think that in literacy or in social studies, that's when we need to be anti-racist, but not realizing that even in the STEM classes or in PE, I mean, how bias can rear its ugly head subconsciously. So I think just always being thoughtful about speaking to every student every day, making sure you're speaking to them all in similar ways, or in ways that, as a female teacher, I wanted to make sure that I was still talking to my male students who I maybe didn't have a whole lot in common with, just to do check-ins with them. Being really aware of that just seems to help. But yes, anti-racist every day, all day, even when you stumble, because we all will, inevitably.
Actually, I have a quick question. Cindy, I don't know how much time we have. I think this might be too big of a question.
Let's go for it.
Let's go for it. We'll see. I'm just squeezing it in just because I've worked in public and independent schools, and culture is different from school to school, let alone from district versus independent schools. But I am curious, Ms. Buggs, or anyone else in the room who wants to share your thoughts on tackling some of this with, not tackling with affinity groups, but using affinity groups as another tool. I've seen it work really well when it's been grounded in part of the culture for a while, but when getting it started has been really, really challenging in a couple of places I've been.
I just got our 1-minute warning, so maybe a quick answer, and then we can continue the conversation.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have put it out there like that.
No, you're fine. Anybody want to tap in? And appropriate think time. Okay, so I'll go. I would say, if you're talking about affinity groups within the school building, yes. If you're talking about affinity groups outside of the school building, also yes. I think it's great to lean on them, making sure that you are using them as like building and developing agendas and thoughts, like using them as true thought partners. Sorry, I think I lost y'all for a second. I just said using them as thought partners. That's all I got.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, bye, see you soon. Hi, friends, how are you?
All right. Oh, and here we are. Hello, everyone.
Really great.
I'm glad.
Yeah. Keep it rolling. We just had graduation, so if I look zoned out, it's because I just was handing out diplomas in a parking lot.
That's exciting, though. Congratulations.
Got to do it eventually, right?
Right.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like we have made it to mile 3 of a strange Zoom sprint. So we are just going to jump right in. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Sydney Britt. I'm the Ed co-facilitator for this afternoon's conversation. And I'm here with Ms. Christiane Buggs. She is the MNPS School Board representative for District 5 and also a founding member and board member of the Equity Alliance. So just a few reminders of today's norms. Please remember to step up and step back, monitoring your own airtime. If you have a question, but you would not like to speak, feel free to drop it in the chat below, and I would be more than happy to introduce that question to you or for you. And finally, if you have any aha moments, please feel free to use the hashtag EdCoWorks. I will also place that in the chat. And without further ado, let's just jump right in.
So she's already done a great job of explaining who I am. Yes, my name is Christiane Buggs. I'm a school board rep. Pretty much I got thrown into education because I had a physics degree from TSU. I worked at NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab branch, which is in Pasadena, and realized that there just was not a lot of diversity. Decided that I would become a teacher, and then lo and behold, had to unpack my own bias because I saw myself pairing up my Black female students with either their white colleagues or their white male colleagues just to make sure they got it. So that's what kind of started my journey into really anti-racist thinking and bias training and thinking about all the different ways that education adds to inequity. So I'm so excited about this conversation. I can't wait to see what kind of dusts up here. So feel free to throw a question out there or even a statement for us to start talking around, conversing about. Well, because I'm a teacher and I know you need some think time, let me just say this while you gather your thoughts. Right after the nation was kind of forced to see an unarmed African-American adult male, cry out for his mother as he was slain, I think we finally realized that, hey, racism is still a thing here. It's something that we need to tackle. But we don't really talk about how education, how in public education specifically, we foster inequity. It's almost inherent with the under-resourcing and the disenfranchisement and with busing and segregation and how that really separated students in inappropriate ways, right? And so a group of friends and I came together, a group of educators came together, and we're developing this education or anti-racism policy, which will be really threefold. It focuses on mandating bias training for all staff, from the custodial staff up to the school board and the director. Then we talk about talent development, whether that be retaining and training teachers or elevating voices of disenfranchised educators. I mean, we have very few Latinx teachers, even fewer Latinx administrators or principals. So it's not just it's not just a Black thing. It's how do we make sure that we elevate disenfranchised voices? And then lastly, we talk. So how do we best support reviewing of curriculum so that it is, it's appropriate language that's being used, that it is not whitewashing not just our history, but the curriculum in all content that we teach. And it's going to be a long on-ramp because, there are a lot of different standards in Tennessee. There are a lot of different grades. So if you'd like to be part of that work, reviewing some of it, please, I'm going to put my information in the chat. I'm sorry. I saw a mouse in my house like a month ago, and I had it like the pest control come out here. So now anytime I hear a flicker of light or something fall, I'm ready to burn the house down. So if I seem jumpy, moment of transparency. Anyway, so I'm going to put my contact info in here. Feel free to reach out. I would love for the community as a whole to review and make suggestions. Now, I'm sure you got something you want to say, right?
So Christian, since you're on the school board, we were trying to decide in the prior chat room if desegregation was an objective.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Are you saying was desegregation an objective of the school board back in the 60s, or is that is it something that we're trying to do now?
Should it be a priority now?
Oh, girl, just.
I know it. I know it.
Okay, so let me provide a little bit of context, and I'll try not to be too long-winded, but I need to offer this. There's a school called Laughlin Design Center. It's an elementary school in my district in East Nashville. And about 10 years ago, it was about 50% Black, 50% white, but extremely low income. With gentrification and the changing demographic of the city, about 10 years ago, a group of families came together. It was about 8 families that came together and said that they were all affluent, they were all white. They said, we're going to send our kids to Laughlin. We're going to change the not just the demographic of the school, but change the dynamic of the school. So they sent their kids there. Lo and behold, 10 years later, it has been a level 5 school for at least the past 6 years, meaning that it has high achievement. It's at 4% free or reduced lunch. It's at 10%, 10% of its students are Black. But less than a mile down the street is the actual zone school for those students, and it is 99% Black, and it is 95% free or reduced lunch. And it had historically been a bit of a struggling school, but this past year was on track to be a reward school, right? So the Laughlin families came together, and it was so funny. They came to us and said, we really want more Black kids in my school. That is literally what a parent said to me. We need more Black kids in my school. And I said, I get it. And he said, well, can you just make some more kids go to our school? Or can you identify a specific number of seats for Black students? And I said, well, that's illegal. So no, we can't. I will say back when I went to MLK, that was the maybe 5-year period where for every 2 white students they let into MLK or Hume Fogg, they let in 1 Black student. True, we all had to still meet the requirements, but that's how we diversified our magnet schools. And if you don't know the historical context of our magnet schools, they were developed to stop white flight. Once, in what is it, 62, when desegregation with the first Mayor Briley, and he was trying to withhold federal funds for schools that wanted to desegregate, a lot of white affluent families fled the city, or they started sending their kids to private schools. So the magnet schools were meant to kind of draw them back to the city. Well, anyway, Laughlin Design Center is considered a magnet school, but it's an optional school, and it's been interesting seeing families say to the district that they want us to do something about something that we have no power over. If it were up to me, everybody could go to their zone school. Their zone school would be fully resourced. The zone schools could have every option for every child. But we don't necessarily live in a city or a state that prioritizes children. We don't seem to really give explicitive about children that aren't ours, right? And so we've got to just shift that narrative. And I think as educators, as supporters of education, we've got to continue to just elevate that with our candidates, with our elected officials, and even with our neighbors. So that's just one thing that I just have got to get out. But specifically with Laughlin and the way that the school board is kind of prioritizing this, it is hard for us to rezone, because even if we were to redraw district lines or to rezone students from affluent neighborhoods to under-resourced schools, parents still have the choice. So if parents and families are not saying, hey, I want my kids to be in diverse situations or in diverse schools, then we'll never be able to have it. So like, I am intentionally sending my child right down the street to what would have been Buena Vista, which is literally our neediest school, because not only does it serve all of the 5 housing or homeless shelters, but it also serves a housing development, housing projects. But I'm sending my child there because not only do I want him to be in a diverse atmosphere, but I also want to be able to elevate the needs of that school. That's a school that's under-resourced and under-advocated for. So me personally, it's a personal stick in the ground, and it is something that I am actively trying to work toward, but it's not something that we can mandate via policy, because there's so many ways that the unintended consequences could even further negatively impact Black students. So long story short, I'm trying to urge all families, especially all affluent families, to consider sending their kids to either their zone school, their neighborhood school, or a school that's under-resourced, because it's not you sacrificing your child. We've got to have that paradigm shift. I'm not sacrificing my child by sending him to Buena Vista, McKissick, and Pearl Cone. I am elevating the needs of those schools, and I'm sending him to school with kids in his neighborhood. I hope that gave you an answer. Those are just a lot of my random thoughts that all connected in my mind.
Ms. Buggs, I appreciate you sharing the story of Laughlin. It'd be very interesting to share the history of Buena Vista too, because there was a period of time where Buena Vista had a very strong program, was considered, I think, number 1 or number 2. And because of zoning and board policy, that shifted. So I think it'll be very interesting to really look at these contrasts so that we can really see what are these variables that are creating what we have in Metro Nashville Public Schools. Because could you talk about that, the Buena Vista history?
Sure. So interestingly enough, I told you I grew up in Bordeaux in the Whites Creek area. So I attended Cumberland for first, second, and third grade. Bordeaux, which is now Ivadetta Davis Early Learning Center, I was there for fourth grade. And then I actually went to Jones for fifth grade, Buena Vista for sixth grade. So Jones and Buena Vista, which have now merged to be the elementary school out here, were actually middle schools, or I guess Jones was technically a first through fifth grade, and then Jones was sixth grade. And so I never really understood why the shift happened. Why was it made in elementary school? Why were students, so I really don't know the full history of it, but I do think it's interesting to say that that school was predominantly Black and was considered a magnet school. It wasn't a test-in magnet though, but I remember us having additional resources that some of my friends at Ewing Park and Brick Church, some of the other middle schools around the city did not have, and I still don't know why. I'm telling you, education is an interesting thing. What happens in the community?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, I mean, I guess over the past decade or so, there have been a number of things that happened. But one of the most recent, and usually it's always associated with rezoning, which literally changed the dynamic of your central city school. I don't want to like the term inner city, but your central city schools. And as a result of rezoning and changing of leadership, you really compromise the program.
There's so much there. And I mean, I think it's interesting that we're not only in a voting.
Like Buena Vista board policy and I think we need to then think about that as we are going forward. And I'll just say this as a little side note. I got a text from a friend a couple of days ago. Why is it that they keep closing all the North Nashville schools? So even with what you all are doing now, there's actually been an assault on North Nashville schools for decades. And it impacts the education of our children just because of board policy.
For sure. And I would love to talk about the Whites Creek situation because I just love to every chance I get. But I told you I grew up in Bordeaux, was zoned to Whites Creek. They rezoned us to Hillwood, I think when I was in 8th grade. So I went on to MLK. When I look at Whites Creek and when I look at the entire cluster and how it's been an underperforming school, there's so many layers to that conversation, or it's an underperforming cluster. There's first the idea that 30% of MNPS kindergartners come into school one full grade level behind. 40% of our first graders come into first grade a full grade level behind. So even before they've learned numbers, colors, letters, before we've had a chance to engage them in pedagogy, they're already coming in behind. That doesn't mean that their parents don't care. It typically means that their parents just don't know what it is that they should be teaching. I have a 2-year-old. I'm trying to teach him a little bit of everything and nothing is sticking because none of it is developmentally appropriate. He can't tell you what yellow is, but I keep going over yellow. He can't identify K, but I'm gonna keep telling him what K is. But it's because of this kind of fear of him going in and being under-resourced or under-prepared. So I'm trying to be vigilant and I might actually be doing some harm. So that's another conversation for another day. But many of the disenfranchised students who are coming into our schools live in District 1. They live in a highly African-American district and they're not getting resources in the community, or their families are not. Then they come to our schools, and our schools are where community issues bubble up, right? But then I'm looking at District 1 and I see that everybody out there isn't poor. In fact, many, if not most of the childbearing age families are not poor. So I think about Charlene Oliver from the Equity Alliance and Alfred DeGraff and Reed, who worked for past Mayor, Governor Bredesen, and Lionel Matthews and Jahari Matthews, juvenile court clerk and the YMCA executive director. I mean, I look at those families, but unfortunately, none of them send their kids to their zone school in District 1. That's not to pick on them, but that is a reality in our African-American our African-American communities. We, as Nashville, as a large community, we have to talk about anti-racism. But frankly, as small Black communities, we've got to talk about classism also. We've got to talk about what it looks like to still pull your child out of your Black neighborhood school because it doesn't do for you what you think it should, because you feel like you're sacrificing to send your child to a Cumberland. So what we have is a Whites Creek cluster, which is all Black, predominantly all Black, predominantly Black. You know what I mean? It's a large Black population. The affluent Black neighbors are pulling their kids out of their own school. No one's at fault here, but that is a reality. So then you're left with not only students who are under-resourced, under-advocated for, typically have families that don't have a long succession of education, or educational advocacy, and then it's underfunded, it's under-resourced, and it's under-enrolled. So I can't look at Whites Creek where they could hold 2,000 kids and they only have 700 there, but then compare that to a Cane Ridge that can hold 3,000 kids and has almost 3,500 kids and say, you know what? We really do need to keep sending money out to Whites Creek, even though they don't have the kids to manage the buildings. So it's, unfortunately, the roosters have come home to nest, right? So you have this long history of under-resourcing in a Black community. You have a long history of classism and racism in that community. And then the school system past policies, past zoning efforts have under-resourced it, but then as a community, we've under-enrolled it. So it's one of those things where we all share a blame, but now we've got to try to fix it. And I don't know how to fix it without encouraging community members to send their kids there. If you make money, don't feel like you've got to send your kids somewhere other than your neighborhood. But that is the rhetoric that we've pushed. That's what we've decided, that, you know, this school is not good enough for my kid because I make more money now. And because I make more money, I don't worry about the other children in my neighborhood. Then there's also the layer of census. And that was what I was going to talk about earlier, that not only are we in an election year, but we're in a census year. And that census, that dictates how we draw lines. So again, I can't say that since Whites Creek High School is under-resourced or under-enrolled, that I'm just going to redraw district lines and I'm going to loop in some more Hunters Lane families, or I'm going to loop in some more Maplewood families, because there will be unintended consequences for both Hunters Lane and Maplewood. But if we had more efficient or more consistent use of the census, we would have a more accurate pool of, or we would have more accurate data. And I would be able to say, all right, in the district that I serve, which is East, North, and South Nashville, I have 42 schools. But in Bellevue, where one of my colleagues represents, they only have, 12 schools? We need to be able to redraw those lines and redistribute the resources in the school buildings. But we can't do that as long as people are opting out, they're not filling out their census forms, or they're not caring about educating other people's families. I know that was such a long monologue, but I hope it was beneficial.
Absolutely. It was definitely beneficial. As we head into our final 5 minutes of time together before closing remarks, just a very quick reminder, you will have a break and then you'll be joining Alicia Ford for another small group, more of a debrief session where you can kind of engage with one another and share some resources. So that'll be very, very exciting. But before we join the main room, are there any more questions for Ms. Buggs?
Hi, Ms. Buggs. My name is John Goddard. I'm the librarian at Cumberland, actually. So thank you for being an advocate for our school. And I just wanted to say that I've enjoyed hearing kind of the more nuanced ideas in this session, in the past sessions about, desegregation and what we can do to support our community schools. But yeah, I just feel like there's a huge concerted effort for the choice schools, the magnet schools, the charter schools, private schools, but there's really not people who are thinking about what can we do, how much energy and support can we give to our community schools so that we can lift up those people and we can help those people in a community way, in a school that's right next to them. So thank you for your support of the community schools idea. I think that's really awesome. And what do you guys think we can do to support community schools better? I mean, I know one thing is not closing as many schools, another person was saying in this, but what do you guys think?
Okay, so while y'all are thinking, I would say individually, if everyone can just commit to using their time, talent, or treasure in some way once a semester, whether that be that you donate money to your neighborhood school, whether that be that, for me, I have a lunch buddy at Fall Hamilton. So on Tuesdays when COVID was not a thing, I was having lunch with her. Now that COVID is a thing, I just do a check-in with her once a week where I call her. You'd be surprised at how that one-on-one relationship can shift the culture in a school. You can also see what is it that that school needs that is tangible that you can either build, donate, or find resources for. Again, you'd be surprised at how long that goes. Then if you're in the school building when COVID is not a thing, you'll also see good things that you can share with the community at large, and that will help change the narrative around the school.
All right, I think that's
Thank
a
you.
fantastic place to end. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you in the main room momentarily. It's been such a great afternoon. Thank you again, Ms. Buggs. You're awesome.
Thank you. No, you all.